thank you all, and thanks to the Chamber for having me here to moderate this panel. And this is the panel on infrastructure challenges and opportunities in harnessing new technologies and leveraging our entire fuel mix. What I say, and Dennis in the previous, or actually Brooks in the previous panel mentioned, surrounding himself with smart people. I always say the most important part of my job is getting the smarter people in the room together to come up with the new ideas. And this is a panel of very, very smart people to talk about infrastructure issues. I want to make this as much of a conversation as possible. I will introduce everyone, and then I'll turn it over to each one to give just a brief kind of 2 to 3 minute remarks. And then I have a couple of questions, but I'm hopeful that some of these questions will lead to discussion. So I encourage the members of the panel to chime in, to jump in at will. I don't want to be a ref or a traffic cop. This will be a little bit of a free-for-all, which I think will be good for dialogue. So I'll go down and mention all the panel members, and then we'll turn it over to Drew. To my immediate right is Drew Fellon, President and CEO of Fellon McCord, which is a brand of Ingersoll Rand. To his right is Stephen Jumper, who's the Director of Corporate Public Policy for WGL Holdings and Washington Gas. Next, Matt LaRock, who's a Manager for Regulatory Affairs for Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina for PJM Interconnection, LLC. Alan Harned is the Executive Director of Virginia Clean Cities. And Aaron Such is the Program Director for Virginia Sun. So with that, I'll turn it over to Drew.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having us here. I did put together a brief presentation just to share with everyone, just to kind of gather our thoughts around that. So if we are live with that, there we go. So we are at Fellon McCord, a brand of Ingersoll Rand, but specifically we're the supply side services group for the Trane organization, which you heard Larry speak just a few minutes ago. And what we put together was some market information, just a brief summary of what we see going on here in the Virginia market. When we work with customers, what we see was when we're talking about infrastructure opportunities, lessons learned and things, we work with some of the largest companies around the world, and they ask, well, if we're going to move to a Virginia, we're going to move to a market location, working with economic development folks, what does that marketplace look like? So here you've got a partially deregulated electricity market for greater than 5 megawatts, fully deregulated for natural gas, PJM operating capacity organization, arguably, if not arguably, the best regional transmission organization in the world. And then, and really, you've got a very adequate input fuel diversity here within PJM and for the Commonwealth. When we look at where the Virginia area sits with regard to electricity cost, the story is a little bit different, but your end user cost is really quite good at 3.5% below the U.S. average, but compared to your neighbors, a little bit high. So when we would look at it, that would be something that we'd want to consider as a point for review. And then quickly looking at how we see the natural gas marketplace and bringing energy, the natural gas supply in here. End user cost is 30% above the U.S. average, but flat to surrounding states. So regionally competitive, but across the country not quite as competitive, and certainly an area for stronger review. And then just looking at some of the larger issues that are taking place in the area, you've got two great pipelines, Transco and Columbia Gas Transmission, bringing energy supply into this market area. You see very attractive low summer costs, but a lot of higher prices in the winter due to a lot of the constraints in this particular market area. Shale gas is helping that out quite a bit, though, as we see what's happening in the Commonwealth. And we think that is something that's going to improve over time due to some of the infrastructure improvements that we have in the market. And then last but not least, a lot of great things happening to improve that, as I just mentioned, with regard to some of the interconnections that are bringing some of that shale gas into the marketplace, really helping with not having to worry about hurricane premiums that we've seen historically for energy supply for this part of the country, and a lot of high voltage transmission expansion work that's going to really make it a much more reliable, competitive area for the Commonwealth. Thank you.
Okay. Stephen?
So, good afternoon. I think I will start really referring to a quote from the Virginia Energy Plan, the 2014 Energy Plan. It speaks of a new Virginia economy, declaring that, quote, access to natural gas means the difference between a growing and vibrant economic base and one of stagnation. So that's what my remarks are going to try to focus on today. Let me put this in some context from a national perspective, and then I'll try to give you a real-life local example. The outlook for natural gas cost and availability is increasingly contributing jobs and revenues at the national, state, and local levels. By 2035, the natural gas exploration and development supply chain is expected to contribute 3.5 million jobs, $475 billion in value added to our nation's GDP, and $125 billion in government revenues. So how does a policy statement like that really apply to the day-to-day economic development in the Commonwealth? So in 2014, Columbia Gas constructed a 6-mile natural gas extension to serve primarily Hoover Treated Wood Products. Hoover Wood Treated Products is a company supplying lumber and plywood products for fire retardant and preservation applications. This company operates in Caroline County and has done so since 1979. Hoover benefited from the construction of this pipeline, which was built under the 2010 NEED legislation, in other words, Natural Gas Infrastructure Expansion for Economic Development. So this investment in a 6-mile natural gas pipeline extension to primarily serve Hoover Wood has had really tripling effect. I spoke to someone earlier today, and already in Caroline County, the county is beginning to see other industrial, other commercial applications come online as a result of this really mere 6-mile pipeline extension. So I think that's a really great example as to how investing in natural gas infrastructure really does have a tremendous economic benefit. The Vice President of Hoover Woods noted that the natural gas pipeline extension would improve operations by reducing energy cost and improving the company's cost position, making it more competitive. And at the end of the day, that's what economic development, I think, is all about. So in 2010, the General Assembly also enacted another very important piece of infrastructure legislation called SAVE, Steps to Advance Virginia's Energy Future. This infrastructure legislation, however, was really designed more to accelerate the replacement of aging natural gas infrastructure. At the time, there were some 38 states in the District of Columbia that had approved accelerated pipeline replacement programs. In other words, to speed up the pace of moving out old bare steel cast iron pipe from utilities. Our investment at Washington Gas was $191 million over a 5-year period of time. But it wasn't just about removing old infrastructure. It was also about lessening our greenhouse gas emissions. Between a 1-year period from April 12 to April 2013, we saw almost 8,500 metric tons of reduced GHG emissions as a result of this accelerated pipeline replacement program just in the Commonwealth. That's equivalent to about 950,000 gallons of gasoline, about 1,700 passenger vehicles, and almost 3,000 tons of waste sent to the landfill. We've seen other legislative initiatives. Just this past year, the General Assembly authorized 2 very important pieces of legislation which Governor McAuliffe has signed, which allows Virginia natural gas utilities to implement programs to extend new infrastructure into unserved areas of the Commonwealth. The program is financed through an expansion rider applying only to new customers served from the new facility. So there is no socialized cost. If you are on the pipeline, you pay. If you aren't on the pipeline, you don't pay. Substantial increases in the cost to construct new infrastructure to unserved areas is really making expansion quite prohibitive. The Interstate Natural Gas Association of America estimates that the cost between $30,000 and $100,000 per inch mile to construct infrastructure pipeline. So in other words, a 24-inch diameter pipeline at a cost of $100,000 per inch mile would cost about $2.4 million per mile. per mile to construct. So you can see why it's important to not only bring the infrastructure, but also to find new approaches to financing that infrastructure. Hayes, I'll wrap up just by commenting just briefly on distributed generation and what distributed generation means for energy security, reliability, and sustainability. So for those of you who are not familiar, distributed generation refers to a variety of power generating technologies that can be combined with load management and energy storage to improve the quality and reliability of electric systems. They're distributed because they are placed at or near the point of energy consumption, unlike traditional centralized systems where electricity is generated at a remote, large-scale power plant and then transmitted down power lines. Energy security is enhanced, sustainability is enhanced, all from distributed generations. One example of Washington Gas's distributed generation business involves the 2.6 megawatt Bloom Energy project in Santa Clara, California. This is a 20-year power purchase agreement that provides clean and reliable power using natural gas and biogas, reducing the county's carbon emissions by nearly 5 million pounds per year. So that's my introduction. I think all of the comments, particularly the Caroline County example, I think is the best example that I can leave you with. Infrastructure does matter. It is a game changer for economic development.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. Matt?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Matt LaRocque. I'm with PJM, and for those of you that may not be familiar with PJM Interconnection, we basically do the transmission planning function. We operate the grid, and we run the largest wholesale electric market actually in the world. And we do this from Chicago, Illinois to New Jersey, down to the Outer Banks of North Carolina in 13 states, and our nation's capital, the District of Columbia. So if you do that triangle, those would be the 13 states plus D.C. So Virginia is a very significant portion of the regional transmission organization, and we're proud to have Virginia in PJM. My remarks, when Hayes came to see me, asked me a couple months ago, would you be on this infrastructure panel? I said, I would love to, because our CEO talks about the need for infrastructure in transmission, and so it was a great opportunity, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. I want to start off with my comments in that our industry and PJM, we're probably facing some of the biggest challenges in our industry's history, frankly. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Everybody's talking about the Clean Power Plan right now, rule proposed by EPA, and it's got a lot of attention in Virginia, but the rule prior to that, the mercury and air toxics rule, which actually goes into effect this week, has had as just a dramatic impact as any. We're looking at 26,000 megawatts of coal-fired generation that's leaving the grid, including 10,000 just this year that'll be leaving in May. And so it's kind of back-end loaded. So we're talking 26,000 megawatts of coal-fired generation. And one of the successes, I believe, with PJM is that as a result of our transmission planning process and our wholesale electric markets, we're successfully managing that risk. And I'll get into that with my remarks. Some of the other challenges are the various renewable portfolio standard mandatory RPSs in some of our states. Now, Virginia's is not mandatory, it's voluntary. But we do have a lot of challenges associated with all the wind and solar coming onto the system. But again, we're managing those risks. And quite frankly, this is the largest fuel switch. Our CEO talks about this all the time, but this is by far and away the largest fuel switch in the history of the industry, with this 26,000 megawatts of coal being replaced by predominantly natural gas, but we're building, there's a lot of wind being built in this country, and there's a ton of solar. And I'll talk a little bit about the solar, because there's a trend going on right now towards large-scale solar. So first, with the transmission planning process that we run, we look at the transmission grid out 15 years. Our board, the PJM board, has approved this. This is an amazing number, I believe. The board has approved $26 billion in infrastructure, with $10 billion of that transmission already built. But we're heading towards $26 billion in transmission projects that have been approved by the board, and that infrastructure is enabling us to manage this huge shift in our generation resources. The other thing that transmission planning process does, which I think is very important, as renewables, including the wind and the solar, becomes more and more relevant going forward. And believe me, we're talking about 7,000 to 8,000 megawatts of that right now online in PJM in nameplate capacity. And in the queue, we're talking about upwards towards 20,000 megawatts potentially. Now, maybe not all of that gets built, but a percentage of that gets built. You can see that we're moving in that direction with renewables. But I wanted to mention that our transmission planning process is kind of interesting because at the request of our states, we run a lot of studies which look at various scenarios of wind and solar development, including offshore wind, which is getting a lot of attention now. We also, through the transmission planning process, address aging infrastructure, which is a fascinating, and I can talk about it in a little bit, a real fascinating project involving Virginia along that line. But in terms of the wholesale markets, one of the key things in terms of managing this transition from the 26,000 megawatts of coal plant retirements to an additional 35,000 megawatts of new generation since 2007, with 6,000 of it clearing in the last auction last May, about 78% of that being natural gas. One of the things that we have found with that 3-year forward capacity market is we have a forward capacity price. That price transparency has allowed for a much smoother management of deactivations on the grid. So our transmission tariff only requires a generator to let us know that they're going to deactivate in 90 days. But because of that forward market, we're averaging about 30 months notice, so almost 3 years notice on these deactivations, which is just huge because they basically, the developers of projects know that these guys are going to be leaving the grid that much sooner, and it allows them to get their projects into the interconnection queue process. So we're managing that with the forward markets. The interesting thing, too, is in spite of those retirements, we're still talking about a reserve margin of around 20%, which is above our required margin of 15%. And one of the most important points, finally, on this whole issue of new capacity, only 1,700 megawatts is required to be on what we call RMR contracts, or required must-run contracts, which are non-economic. Most of the regions that operate the grids in the rest of the country have much higher numbers in terms of these non-economic contracts that they're having to keep on because of the retirements of these coal facilities. And I can talk about it later. I don't want to take too much time here, but there are large-scale solar projects, and two that were making some news in North Carolina, 75 megawatt and 40 megawatt solar projects down in Dominion's North Carolina footprint that pointed to the PJM wholesale markets as a possibility for them to deliver the energy. So,
Thanks, Matt. Alan?
Hayes, thank you. And I'm going to talk about another fuel switch. My name is Alan Harnett. I'm with Virginia Clean Cities, which is the state's alternative fuel vehicle coalition and vehicle efficiency coalition. Infrastructure for us is the challenge, infrastructure to refuel vehicles. So this would be for more sustainable fuels, choices like ethanol and biodiesel, which are agricultural and recycled fuels that are made in Virginia, natural gas and propane, and all of which are, we're pulling out of the ground at very affordable rates. Fuels which all just burn in traditional engines, but with some modifications necessary as appropriate. And then electric vehicles, which are 95% efficient, and folks that drive them plug their cars in at home. These are fuels that are sustainable in cost, with potential significant benefits to the community, and that march towards energy, environmental, and economic security for a state that doesn't produce any significant quantities of oil. It's a great opportunity. But this infrastructure challenge is seen by many as a chicken and the egg issue. Do we build the stations? Where do the cars come? How do we mix and match? I like to see it more as maybe a fountain and the glass issue. We just need to have a place to refill our water glass. What do we fill it up with, and where do we fill it, and what are we filling? Once we just get started, we can move to different stations and move to different vehicles to the different stations. So right now we have about 400 alternative fuel stations, and we've got a chance to move forward. And the problem is vision. When we think about a gasoline station, we sort of stop there. But with vehicle fuel, it moves beyond gasoline. We've got diesel, we've got alternative fuels, and we've got other smarter ways to use our energy and have viable solutions for the economy. So the vision is to move from hundreds of alternative fuel stations to thousands, to enough of a deployment that this isn't a niche issue, but it's just an option, a choice for consumers. And leaders are needed to see that value and to benefit from those improvements, either with their own companies or with their own fleets or with their own communities. So leaders to review and to take action. One success we've had with kind of the challenge of where do we get started, a year ago, Virginia had no DC fast chargers for electric vehicles, which would be places where an electric vehicle could recharge, could refuel in 20 to 30 minutes. So one successful project that we've had in the last year was deploying 21 electric vehicle chargers, these game-changing pieces of equipment from Roanoke to Stanton to Charlottesville to Richmond to Williamsburg, Norfolk, and Virginia Beach, to build on the already growing network nationwide of this type of equipment, fast charging electric vehicle equipment that's nationwide and in Northern Virginia. This equipment moves 50 kilowatts of electricity into these new appliances of electric vehicles, and it creates a consumer choice. So in 1 year, we've been able to lay out the red carpet so the 100-mile range electric vehicles are able to travel not just in their cities, but throughout Virginia. And it took vision and it took individuals to take the step forward. So one guy I'd highlight in that program is a gentleman named Mac McManus, who runs the Mac Service Center in Ashland, Virginia. He wanted a way to differentiate his service station from other repair facilities in the area. And an electric vehicle fast charger fit the bill. It was something that was not so expensive to install, that he was able to make that business choice, and then he was able to kind of be the first charger in Ashland, Virginia. Now he has highway vehicles stopping at his place, trading business cards, and he's actually made a business model from this. But new infrastructure like this is a big change. 20 years ago, the idea of wireless internet being ubiquitous would be crazy. And public Wi-Fi, publicly accessible Wi-Fi like we have in this room today, would be potentially beyond possibility. But now, if businesses aren't doing it, if convention centers don't have it available, then they're missing the curve and they're falling behind. And the gas station is going to be the same way. Visionary people are needed to be out there to see this through. This means executive, financial, and facilities folks working together on realistic solutions. Not every solution is going to work out for your business, but just being able to know that the information's out there, it can make a big impact. So, this is happening. There's proof in the pudding. This has been done. UPS, Dominion Power, Washington Gas, Virginia Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy have started to make these switches to alternative fuels, and it takes leadership and a willingness to learn. I think we can just keep moving with visionary leaders.
Thanks, Alan. Aaron?
Oh, thank you. It is a pleasure to be up here on a panel. I really echo a lot of the thoughts that our fellow panelists said regarding some of the challenges. My program is Virginia Sun. It stands for Virginia Solar United Neighborhoods, and we help people go solar. We do this through solarized bulk purchase projects that help reduce the upfront cost barriers and transaction barriers for residents and business owners that want to go solar. We also offer technical support as well as nonpartisan policy advocacy. And I wanted to touch, at least preface a lot of my comments on the challenges. To put them in perspective, we have the Clean Power Plan, MATS, as well as a grid infrastructure, as Alan was saying, that's changing. Much like communications has changed from a one-way centralized communication, our grid infrastructure is changing that way too. It's very shortly becoming two-way, interactive. We have electric vehicles, storage options that are plugging in, and of course, renewable distributed generation and just distributed generation in general. So we see that solar distributed generation, as Mr. Jumper pointed out, distributed generation is close or at the point of consumption, offers a tremendous opportunity for Virginians to generate clean, locally produced energy, as well as create economic opportunity. To give you just a little bit of a national perspective, 53% of all the electric generation capacity that went online last year was from solar in the United States. The industry creates 174,000 jobs, 174,000 jobs it employs, but is growing at 10 times the rate of the national U.S. economy. It is actually one of the fastest growing sectors in the United States. At the same time, solar installation prices are falling dramatically. Since 2010, we've seen solar installations across the states drop by half as far as price. Last year in Virginia alone, the price to install solar dropped by 13%. And luckily, we're seeing our leaders taking action in a nonpartisan way that's going to support that momentum. Governor McAuliffe signed the Solar Development Authority. And this last legislative session, we had House Bill 2219, which in a nonpartisan way declared the development of solar to be in the public interest. So here's why, just to couch it back to Virginia terms. Half of our electric generation is from non-renewable fossil fuel resources. And no matter what your thoughts are on the environment, these are commodity fuels which are subject to international price demand. In addition to that, 40% of the electricity generated and consumed in Virginia actually has to be imported from out of state. So we see this as a tremendous opportunity to empower Virginians to produce clean, locally produced energy and economic opportunity. In addition, to relate to some of the grid challenges that Mr. LaRocque mentioned, we see it as an opportunity to complement the grid as an efficiency measure. Every kilowatt hour of electricity generated by solar isn't one that has to be spent on a fuel. In addition, as an overall demand response, in greater penetrations can reduce wear and tear to the grid infrastructure. So these are some of the benefits, and just to give you some concrete examples of what we're helping to do, Virginia Sun is a really collaborative organization, and we've had the luck to collaborate with a few other organizations to start some of these solarized programs. And the first one in the state of Virginia, which spawned, actually there's more than 20 active, or 20 now that are active and have been completed, was in solarized Blacksburg. Over a year and a half ago, Virginia Sun partnered with the town of Blacksburg as well as community housing partners to do a solarized program to reduce the upfront price of solar and the transaction barriers. And some of the data is pretty impressive. We took 57 residential homeowners solar, installed about a third of a megawatt worth of generation capacity, but did $1 million worth of retail solar sales to 2 local companies. So that economic opportunity stayed in the community. So this is just one example of ways in which kind of these distributed solutions are working in lockstep with some of the overall kind of bigger picture solutions. And lastly, we're fighting for fair solar market access so that we can continue to do this. It's not a partisan or a political fight. In fact, we work with non-traditional solar advocates, conservative Tea Party people, non-climate change folks that want to see the economic opportunity. And so we're using this to help push this forward and really benefit Virginians. Again, it's a real pleasure to be up on the panel. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. So you can see that we have a diverse knowledge base here, sitting up here. And as I'm listening to everybody talk, one word, and this is a word that my boss, the governor, has said a lot, is diversity. We're hearing that there is more diversity in the fuel types and the fuel sources that are being used, primarily for generation, but also where it's being built, where there are resources that are actually location specific, the types, the size. You go from distributed generation, the small scale, to the large scale. You have base load, you have intermittent. So I'm going to start with Matt, and I'm going to throw this question out there. What is it going to take to ensure that our infrastructure system can handle this and be resilient, be reliable, which are two top priorities, but be dynamic and adaptive as well?
I think that's a great question. I really think the great opportunity there is that whole transmission planning process that I was talking about, because it's an interesting process because it's driven by our stakeholders, which includes all of our members, and they all have very diverse, perspectives. We have some companies that are heavy nuclear. We have other companies that are just wind developers, solar developers, a lot of natural gas development, both traditional utility and unregulated developers. But the transmission planning process is kind of interesting in that it brings all these perspectives to the table. And PJM facilitates that process, and we're looking out 15 years into the future. And obviously, we're looking at the 26,000 megawatts of coal plant retirements that we're managing today. And we're looking at the potential. I didn't give a number earlier on the Clean Power Plan, but we see the risk of somewhere between 6,000 and 32,000 megawatts, again, in coal-fired generation that might be at risk. But again, we haven't finished that reliability analysis. That's a very complicated analysis, a lot of assumptions. But that transmission planning process is looking at that reliability risk of the Clean Power Plan, which will be coming out later this year. But again, that process brings in all the players, whether it's transmission, generation solutions, renewables, and they're all consolidated in this master plan every year. And we take an approved set of transmission projects coming out of that, we take it to the board, and the board has to go ahead and approve it. But it's looking out 15 years, and it's got a lot of diversity in terms of supply and membership, which is a good thing.
Anybody want to add anything?
I think that in the scope of this, there's a really good thoughts from Matt, and I think this collaboration and this planning coming together is of huge value in a number of different areas. One thing I would say is that information is also king here. We heard from Aaron about soft costs being high, and one way to lower it was with these collaborative joint projects. So partnership and information can lead to the best level of planning, and then can help mature these markets.
Yeah, I was going to say more of this type of event and this type of information exchange with all of the stakeholders involved, so that they can really express what their thoughts and concerns are, get those out on the table, figure out how to use less energy, and then what's left over, make sure they're getting it when they want it and when they need it, and still meeting all of the other constituents' requirements and needs from an environmental perspective.
I think that's an interesting point, Stephen.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. It's a topic that I spend a lot of time thinking about. If we think about urbanization, 51% of the world's population is going to live in an urban area by 2030. And so for a company like Washington Gas, who serves a really urban market, what does that mean for energy resources? What kind of strain does that population growth and that urbanization put on energy systems? And I just think it forces us to rethink development differently, and that's where I think, things like distributed generation really comes into play. The Washington Council of Government, I think, has put a price tag saying that within the COG footprint, that there needs to be about a $5 billion investment in energy infrastructure, really just to keep up with the pace of our growth in our region.
That's interesting, and Drew, what you said as well ties into this. Energy efficiency. When we talk about needing to plan for the future and the time and the capital that it takes to build out the infrastructure to ensure reliability and resiliency, at the same time, a big push and prioritization to decrease the actual usage. How do you balance the need for that infrastructure and the need to plan the future with this idea of actually trying to consume less in order to build less? Now I'm going to leave that one open for anybody who wants to dive in. Yeah, Aaron, please.
I think with regards to infrastructure and to kind of play on some of the points is that we really need to have more involvement, as was mentioned, more communication with stakeholders, and realize some of the obstacles. By far, energy efficiency, as a solar guy, I always get it from the old salty guys that say energy efficiency is the smartest, most cost-effective thing. It is. The problem is it's not sexy, and it assumes that everybody thinks rationally and is energy literate. So what we need to have is more of an interactive approach to reach out to those folks and start taking responsibility. From a larger level, there are definitely some challenges, but from more the distributed, decentralized perspective, we're starting to see folks as they become more energy literate, realizing that energy is a huge issue. They're starting to kind of make a virtuous cycle as far as energy efficiency and building on some of the larger picture initiatives that are happening from a kind of a 30,000-foot level.
I think in any budgeted environment, the business environment or the government environment, given the opportunity to plan and to use efficiency kind of as that stopgap is of value, because a lot of new infrastructure can be delayed using efficiency, but there is still going to need to be some improvements in a number of different areas. And there's also some trade-offs there, again, getting to the information. There are going to be times when infrastructure actually does beat efficiency, despite what Aaron's old salty friends would say. But efficiency is low-hanging fruit, so you got to go after it.
I would throw out there that energy efficiency has been an incredibly important piece of PJM because it's really changed our load forecast. Since the Great Recession, our load forecast has been undershooting. I mean, the actuals have been undershooting the load forecast because if you look at history, our load forecasts increase after recessions historically have been rather dramatic. But since the Great Recession, we've seen a load forecast numbers around 1%. And Northern Virginia and the D.C. area, Northern Virginia, has actually the highest projected growth in PJM of all those 13 states plus D.C. But it's dramatically changed our load forecast. And it has slowed down the need for new transmission and new generation. It's helped us manage this transition, losing 26,000 megawatts of coal. So that's kind of how I would look at it.
Drew, did you have anything?
Yeah, I think that, we came out of the sustainability session right after lunch, and some great companies talking about driving down the amount of energy they're using, whether it's diesel fuel or what have you, with regard to UPS and the Norfolk Southern folks, as well as any of the other manufacturers we have in the country, and they're all trying to appeal to either their shareholders or their consumer groups that they are selling into. And whether they're a tier 1, tier 2 supplier or they're directly selling to the consumers, that is what the marketplace was looking for today. And so, listening to that and having the communication amongst all the groups is critically important. One of the things that we talked about is that having a certain amount of intellectual honesty in a nonpartisan way about, all right, how are we going to do that and measuring it, and so that the fine companies like the folks at Washington Gas or inside PJM can manage their businesses in a way that still meets the requirements, so that when we do walk in a room and we hit the light switch, it does exactly what we've all become accustomed to doing. Because we want to live in a climate-controlled environment. We want the lights to work when we want them to work, and we want to be live in a safe world. And electricity is one of the most civilized things that marks the world, and or it marks a civilized society. And our ability to manage that, I think, is what it takes for these kind of groups to do.
It's very interesting. I want to hit on this point as we're getting close to time, and I'll throw this out to Stephen here on behalf of Washington Gas. We talk about natural gas, the availability of it here in the U.S. In Virginia, we have not, to date, tapped into the gas coming from we'll say the shale revolution. There are proposed transmission pipelines that are working their way through the federal process. When we get this idea of an increase in transmission, an increase in use of natural gas for generation purposes, we talk about distribution challenges that you mentioned in your remarks. We talk about leakage along the supply chain, getting it from the well to the home or to the business, and what type of efficiencies or lack thereof that we're getting along the entire supply chain. What are you as Washington Gas dealing with as a gas company in terms of how to deal with the constraint issues, the transmission issues, the leakage issues, all the way across the board as you guys think towards the future?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, we are an investor in pipelines, in interstate pipelines. We actually are partners in 2 interstate pipelines that will be supplying natural gas to the Northeast region. I guess, 5 years ago, maybe a little longer than that, gas supply flowed south to north, from the Gulf Coast. Now that gas supply flows just the opposite direction. In terms of leakage, the accelerated pipeline replacement programs that I spoke about earlier have had a tremendous impact on the amount of methane gas that escapes from natural gas pipelines. I've seen studies that say that from the distribution point, only less than 1%, like 0.25% of methane gas comes from the distribution part of the pipeline. So I think, and so you take that and you couple it with the accelerated pipeline replacement projects that all of the gas companies are doing around the country. This is not unique to Washington Gas. I think that's where, you begin to see an impact and you begin to make an impact. But it's about, one, capacity, and then the ability to get that capacity to the end destination or the end user. So.
And I would just dovetail on the gas component. And Alan, you talk about the alternative fuel vehicles. Now, a lot of that gas is shipped from one location to another. How does that play into distribution, the distribution network, in terms of getting those stations in the right places?
It's a huge concern. You heard Stephen talk about the price of the mile of natural gas pipeline, and you want to compress natural gas to 3,600 PSI for a vehicle, and then you want to store some of it. So you almost need to pair up and to coordinate with things like the NEAT program, where it's appropriate to link up that level of construction with new facilities. The same is true for electric vehicle infrastructure, but just to a lesser extent because they're not using as much electricity. For a natural gas station, you would also need the phase 3, high voltage power to deal with the compression. So it involves planning, and it involves collaboration, and it involves plenty of Excel spreadsheets by your executives and your financial guys just to get it done.
Great. Well, we got about a minute and a half left, and I'm going to once again steal an idea from Dennis from the last panel, and I'm going to do a lightning round, and it's going to be very simple, very straightforward question, and I'll start with Drew. The biggest challenge in the infrastructure space in the next 10 years?
Reality around the time it takes to make the changes that are needed to meet the needs of the country.
Stephen?
Cost sharing, how to equitably share the cost.
Matt?
Managing that huge fuel switch that we're going through right now and will continue to go through under the Clean Power Plan. And I agree, cost allocation is going to be absolutely huge when you're talking about $26 billion in transmission.
Inertia. It's going to take people that are willing to go back to those spreadsheets and plan it out. We're used to driving on gasoline.
Yeah, I would say fuel transition and just getting folks prepared to have more of a two-way interaction with the grid.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thanks to all of our panelists. Please, a round of applause for all of our panelists.